Hey, you know how sometimes you hear about a story that just makes you stop and think, wait, how do those things even connect?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's exactly what happened when I started looking into this case. We're going to take a deep dive today into something that pulls together immigration, free speech, and even foreign policy
Yeah.
in a way that's honestly pretty wild. It's all centered around Mahmoud Khalil, this activist at Columbia University, who's suddenly facing, well, deportation.
Exactly. And for you to really understand what's going on here, we need to look at this from a few different angles. It's not just a straightforward immigration thing.
Right.
It touches on some really fundamental ideas about what rights people have in the U.S., even if they're not citizens, you know?
Yeah, and how much the government can step in.
Right, when speech crosses into areas like foreign relations. We've been digging through excerpts from a CBS News article that lays out some of the recent developments in his case.
Okay, so our mission today, if you want to think of it that way, is to kind of unpack this whole Khalil situation.
Mm-hmm.
We want to get to the bottom of why the government is trying to deport him and what this case might tell us about, like, the rules around immigration and free speech in the U.S. today.
Okay.
Let's start with the basics for you. Who is Mahmoud Khalil and what kicked all of this off?
So Mahmoud Khalil is someone who's been living in the United States legally. He's a permanent resident.
Okay, a green card holder.
Right. And the reason he's facing deportation right now is because of his involvement in protests. These were protests on the Columbia University campus, and they were critical of Israel. Now, this is a really crucial point for you to understand. The government hasn't accused him of breaking any laws.
No crime.
No crime, no criminal charges. Instead, they're using civil immigration laws to try and deport him.
Civil laws. Okay, that's an important distinction for us to keep in mind. So what are these civil grounds then? The article mentioned a couple of things.
Yes, there are two main arguments. These were initially put forward by the previous administration. The first one, and this is where things get a bit unusual, is the idea that Khalil's being in the U.S. could lead to potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences.
Oh, well, okay. And the second?
The second argument is an allegation of immigration fraud. They say it happened when he applied for his green card.
Adverse foreign policy consequences. That sounds, yeah, really significant, but also kind of vague.
It is.
Where does that idea even come from in immigration law? Is that common?
Not common at all. It comes from a part of immigration law that isn't used very often. Basically, it gives the government the power to try and deport someone if they believe that person's presence or actions could, seriously damage the United States' relationships or policies with other countries.
Okay.
But what's really striking about this, for you to consider, is how rarely this specific provision is invoked, especially in cases tied to, like, domestic protests.
Right, not like espionage or something.
Exactly. Typically, it's reserved for situations involving espionage or, direct threats to national security, not criticism of a foreign government, even if it's an ally. So this really raises a big question about the government's interpretation, maybe expanding interpretation of this law.
Okay, let's dig a little deeper into this adverse foreign policy angle.
Yeah.
The article mentioned Secretary of State Marco Rubio being involved. How does he fit into this?
That's right. The Department of Homeland Security, when they were facing a deadline to present their reasoning, they submitted a memo. And that memo came from Secretary Rubio outlining this exact rationale.
And what did Rubio actually argue? What's the connection he drew between Khalil being here and these supposed adverse consequences?
Well, according to the memo, Rubio argued that Khalil's presence in the U.S. undermines U.S. policy to combat anti-Semitism around the world and in the United States.
Okay.
In addition to efforts to protect Jewish students from harassment and violence in the United States.
Wow. So if I'm getting this right, the Secretary of State is basically saying that because Khalil participated in protests critical of Israel, that harms the U.S.'s efforts against anti-Semitism and to keep students safe.
That's the argument presented in the memo. Yes.
Did Rubio offer any specifics, like evidence linking Khalil's actions directly to these bad foreign policy outcomes?
The CBS News article explicitly says that Rubio cited no specific evidence against Khalil.
None.
None cited in the article. It's a broad assertion, really, about the impact of his presence and activities. And it's also really important for you to know Khalil's wife is an American citizen.
Oh, wow.
And she's in the late stages of pregnancy. So that adds a whole other layer of complexity and, frankly, human cost to this whole situation.
Absolutely. So you've got the government making this big foreign policy argument on one side, and then Khalil's actual life here, his family, on the other. Okay, let's look at the legal side. What did the judge in the immigration court say about this adverse foreign policy argument?
So, the judge, Assistant Chief Immigration Judge Jamie Comins, ruled on this. She found that the government's determination that Khalil poses these adverse foreign policy consequences is facially reasonable.
Facially reasonable. Okay, that sounds like legal speak.
Yeah, it is.
What does that actually mean for the case? Does it mean the judge agrees with the government? Or...
Not necessarily agrees, no. Facially reasonable basically suggests that on the surface, the government's argument isn't completely absurd or, without any basis.
Okay.
So while it's not a definitive win for the government, it's a hurdle Khalil's team needs to clear. The judge is essentially saying, look, on its face, this argument isn't totally out there, so we'll let the process continue on this basis for now.
Gotcha. So the argument stays in play.
For now, yes. And the judge has given Khalil's legal team until April 23rd to file applications for relief ways to try and stop the deportation on this specific ground.
So Khalil's lawyers are definitely pushing back.
Oh, absolutely.
What's their take on this whole adverse foreign policy thing? What are they telling the court?
They are strongly contesting it. The article mentions they harshly criticized Rubio's memo.
Yeah.
And they're arguing that the government is violating Khalil's right to free speech. Johnny Sinotis, one of Khalil's attorneys, made a really powerful statement that I think is important for you to hear.
Okay.
He said, basically, that if the Secretary of State can deport someone just for disagreeing with U.S. foreign policy, then there are no limits to executive power. He argued there would be no beginning and no end to that kind of executive power.
Wow. That really hits home, doesn't it?
It does.
For you to think about, it raises this huge question. Could criticizing a foreign government, even a close ally, suddenly become grounds for deportation? It feels like a really slippery slope.
It absolutely does feel that way. It gets right to the heart of free speech and, crucially, how much that applies to people who aren't citizens but are living here legally.
Right.
The idea that just voicing a different opinion on foreign policy could be seen as grounds for removal, that's a pretty big shift from how immigration enforcement has typically worked.
Okay, so that's one major track here, this adverse foreign policy claim. But the article also mentioned a second reason the government's trying to deport Khalil, immigration fraud. What's the story behind that?
Right, the second ground. The government is also alleging that Khalil committed immigration fraud when he filled out his green card application.
Oh, so?
They're claiming he didn't properly disclose his work history. Specifically, they pointed to work he did for the British Embassy in Beirut and also for the UN agency that deals with Palestinian migrants and refugees, UNRWA.
And what's the status of that specific allegation right now? Is the judge looking at that one too?
Well, Judge Comins has currently put that deportation ground in abeyance.
In abeyance, meaning?
Basically, set aside temporarily. It looks like the main focus of the legal proceedings right now is on this more unusual, more constitutionally charged argument about adverse foreign policy consequences.
Interesting. So while this fraud claim is still technically there,
it's on the back burner for now.
The really novel and maybe more concerning part is this foreign policy argument.
Okay.
Now, the article also mentioned Khalil filed a separate lawsuit in federal court.
That's right. He's fighting this on two fronts. In addition to the immigration court case, Khalil has also taken the government to federal court in New Jersey.
And what's he trying to achieve with that lawsuit?
It has a few main goals. First, pretty straightforward, he's trying to get released from detention.
Okay.
Second, he wants the court to order Secretary Rubio to actually withdraw his determination about the adverse foreign policy consequences.
Rescind the memo, essentially.
Exactly. And maybe the broadest goal, he's asking the court to prevent the government from targeting non-citizens for expressing their views, specifically views related to Palestinian rights or criticism of Israel. He's arguing this is constitutionally protected expression.
So that federal lawsuit sounds like a more direct challenge to the power to deport someone based on what they've said.
Yes. He's arguing basically that the First Amendment, even if it applies differently to non-citizens, still gives him some protection against being deported just for his political opinions.
That's the core of it. He's trying to establish a legal precedent here, one that would shield non-citizens from being penalized for political speech, especially when it's the kind of speech generally considered protected under the Constitution for citizens.
This whole case feels like it's sitting right at the intersection of some really fundamental principles.
Absolutely.
You've got national security concerns, maybe, foreign policy goals, and then the rights, or at least the protections for people who live here but aren't citizens. How do you see this fitting into the bigger picture?
Well, this case is pretty unique because it uses this adverse foreign policy consequences clause
Hmm.
based on someone's protest activity. That's the unusual part.
Right.
It really highlights the potential for conflict between, the government's need to manage foreign relations and the basic principles of free speech and due process.
Hmm. It raises some really important questions for you about how much the government can use immigration laws to essentially control political dissent, especially from non-citizens.
Yeah.
The outcome here could have a pretty big impact on activism and the freedom to express opinions in the U.S., especially if certain viewpoints on international matters could lead to deportation.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder about the chilling effect, right?
Exactly.
Would other non-citizens hesitate to speak out on sensitive international issues if they're worried about facing something similar?
Hmm.
It's definitely a case that could have ripples far beyond just Mahmoud Khalil himself.
It really could. And the fact that a judge has said the government's argument is facially reasonable, even apparently without specific evidence linking his actions to actual harm,
Right, that's key.
that really underscores how complex and potentially vulnerable non-citizens can be in these kinds of situations.
So just to kind of bring it all together for you listening, Mahmoud Khalil, a legal permanent resident, is facing potential deportation.
Yeah.
The government has put forward two main reasons. First, this idea that his involvement in protests against Israel could have negative consequences for U.S. foreign policy. A judge has said this argument is reasonable enough to proceed for now.
Facially reasonable.
Facially reasonable, right? Although his lawyers are fighting back hard. And second, there's this claim of immigration fraud, which seems to be on hold for the moment.
Correct.
And at the same time, Khalil has also filed his own lawsuit in federal court, arguing his right to free speech is being violated.
That's a really clear summary of a situation with a lot of, well, moving parts.
Yeah, definitely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it really leaves you with some pretty significant things to chew on.
Hmm.
What are the long-term implications for free speech and the rights of non-citizens if just expressing dissenting views on foreign policy can potentially lead to deportation?
Yeah, that's the big question.
How should a government balance what it sees as its national interests, its foreign policy goals, with protecting fundamental rights, even for people who aren't citizens?
It's a tough balance.
It really is. It's definitely something to keep thinking about as this case continues to unfold.